Today we'll be discussing blockers. Definitely a very tricky topic, and I'm sure many of you guys have had the experience of staring at the scene for hours and hours, trying to figure out why the solver bluffs with Jack 10 of hearts but not Jack 10 of spades. And just when you think you finally figured it out, you pull up a slightly different board, and now the solver is bluffing with spades instead. If that sounds like you, then definitely stay till the end because I'm going to cover two simple concepts that will help you find the right bluffs in any situation. Let's talk a little bit about how not to think about blockers. So I want you guys to imagine that we're barreling down on an ace-high board against a range of mostly ace-x bluff catchers. And in terms of our own range, we have ace-king, which is the main hand we're betting for value. And to balance our ace-king, we have a bunch of bluffs like Jack 10 and 9-8. And a very common approach here is to try to choose the bluffs that block our opponent's best calls. So in this case, a certain player might argue that we should be bluffing with Jack 10 because we block ace-jack and ace-10, which are the most likely calls in villain's range. But of course, the problem with this is that villain's strategy is actually dynamic, meaning if we choose to bluff with Jack 10 all the time, what villain can do to take advantage of that is just to fold with ace-jack and ace-10 and prefer calling with ace-9 and ace-8 instead, since ace-jack and ace-10 would now block our main bluff. And once he starts doing this, it actually becomes pretty bad for us to bluff with Jack 10 since we no longer block that many calls in his range. So now we would start preferring to bluff with 9-8 instead. And once again, villain can just adjust by folding ace-9 and ace-8 and preferring to call with ace-jack and ace-10. And of course, that in turn would make us want to start bluffing with Jack 10 again. So we end up stuck in this sort of endless cycle where, we can't really identify any kind of good bluff in our range because the fact is there just isn't any specific hand in our range that has good properties for bluffing. If you run this toy game in the solver, you'll see that it wants to bluff Jack 10 and 9-8 at exactly the same frequency because once we fail to do this, and once we start bluffing one of these hands more than the other, then it's going to create a situation where our opponent can exploit us by calling more often with some bluff catchers and folding more often with others. And he's actually going to gain a little bit of EV by doing so. So what we end up with is a situation where neither Jack 10 nor 9-8 are particularly good bluffs. And so this brings us back to the question of what exactly does make a good bluff? And one possible way that we can approach this question is to understand that if we can bluff a certain hand without making villain adjust in a way that makes our blockers bad, then and only then would our hand be a good bluff. So going along with the same example, Jack 10 would not qualify as a good bluff because if we were to bluff this hand most or all of the time, villain would adjust in a way that makes our blockers bad because he would just be folding ace-jack and ace-10 and calling ace-9 and ace-8 instead. So what we need is a situation where we bluff with Jack 10, but villain still continues to call with ace-jack and ace-10. And this sounds almost impossible because why would he continue calling with ace-jack and ace-10 knowing that he's blocking all of this Jack 10 that we are bluffing with? But it turns out that there are actually two main scenarios where this is possible. And the first one is when our bluffs share cards with our value range. Here I've made one small change to our toy game. I've added in a couple of combos of Jack 3 and 10 3 into the aggressor's range. And these hands are full houses, so they're actually a part of our value range. And the idea is that the presence of these hands in our range, they make our opponent a little bit more inclined to call down with ace-jack and ace-10. So it's actually possible to have a situation where we're bluffing with Jack 10 and our opponent doesn't get to adjust in a way that makes our blockers bad. He doesn't just get to fold ace-jack and ace-10 all the time and call ace-9 and ace-8 because there's actually something going for ace-jack and ace-10 in this situation, which is that they block our nut hands. So he's kind of in a difficult spot where on one hand he wants to call ace-jack and ace-10 since they remove a lot of strong hands in our range, but on the other hand, they also block a whole lot of bluffs, which is generally not a good thing when you're bluff catching. So there are a lot of situations where you'll see that the solver actually prefers to bluff with hands that share cards with its value range. And the reason why it does this is because any other strategy would leave it exploitable. For example, in this case, if we were to bluff with 9-8 more often than Jack-10, our opponent would have a really easy counter strategy of calling with Ace-Jack and Ace-10 all the time and folding with Ace-9 and Ace-8 all the time. Ace-Jack, Ace-10, these hands, they're just going to block a whole bunch of value and block 0 bluffs in our range. And similarly, Ace-9 and Ace-8 are going to be terrible calls because they only block bluffs and 0 value. And once our opponent starts to adjust in this way, now when you look at it from our perspective, naturally Jack-10 is going to be an excellent bluff. So no matter what kind of strategy we start off with, our opponent will always adjust in a way that makes the equilibrium shift back towards Jack-10 being a much better bluff than 9-8. And once again, the reason for that is that it shares cards with our value range. Here's a question to test your understanding. Button open versus big blind call. After big blind check calls the flop and the turn goes check check. He likes to check jam 8x and 9x on the river because A, we block the nuts, B, we share cards with our value range, or C, all of the above. If your answer was C, then you are unfortunately incorrect. The correct answer is B. We share cards with our value range. And the reason why A is not a factor is because button has actually bet all of his straights on the turn. This is quite a high SPR situation, so there's quite a big opportunity cost of checking back the nuts. Generally speaking, when the stacks are quite deep, you just want to fast play your strong hands, especially in position instead of checking behind and just playing like such a small pot on the river. You basically lose all hope of stacking your opponent. And that's why when we look at Button's range on the river, we see that he really doesn't have like any significant amount of straights. But still 8x and 9x make pretty good hands to check raise. And in fact, they are the main bluffs that we're choosing when you look at what our check jamming range is made up of. So this once again has to do with trying to choose bluffs that share cards with our value. Since the bulk of our value range is 9-8, it makes sense to choose hands that contain an 8 or a 9, since our opponent is going to be quite inclined to call with hands like Ace-9 as well as Ace-8. You can see that these hands are actually some of his best unpaired bluff catchers. He's much more inclined to call something like Ace-9 as opposed to Ace-King or Ace-Queen, simply because Ace-9 blocks a good chunk of our value range. And I want to take this chance to introduce some of the new features that got released in the latest update. If you click on the Summary tab, you'll see a couple of new columns that say Value Removal as well as Trash Removal. And what these numbers really signify is, for example, if we look at it from Big Blind's perspective, a high value removal score simply means that you block lots of your opponent's value bets. And a low value removal score means that you do not block any value bets in your opponent's range. So this works on the scale from 1 to 10. And if we take a look at some of these 10-9 and 10-8 hands, you can see that they really do not have that great of value removal. And that's because when you look at Button's value betting range, you can see that the bulk of his value range is really Ace-X. Once again, the turn has gone check-check, so he's really not going to have that many straights and sets and two pairs. And many of the two pair hands that he has actually do contain an ace. And that's the reason why, from the big blind's perspective, it's so powerful to have a hand that contains an ace. Looking at the value removal scores, you can see that most of these Ace-X hands, they have a score of 9 to 10, and there's a certain threshold where you go down to somewhere around Ace-6. You can see that the value removal score drops drastically. So basically any hand with an ace is going to remove a big part of your opponent's value betting range, and any hand without an ace is just not going to do a great job of blocking your opponent's value. And so the same goes with hands like 10-9 and 10-8. You can see they really do not have a great value removal score, but still they make excellent bluff check raises because they share cards with our value range. Since the bulk of our value check jamming range is 9-8, it kind of makes our opponent more inclined to call with hands like Ace-8 and Ace-9. And you can kind of tell from Ace-9's high value removal score that it does a good job of blocking all of these straights in the big blind's range. Whereas a hand like Ace-King, by comparison, is really not going to remove that much of our opponent's value. There's also one more new feature that I want to show, and that's this tab called Blockers. So when you hover over the Ace of Clubs, for example, it says if your opponent holds the Ace of Clubs, your fold frequency will increase by 0.63%. And what this means is that if the big blind holds the Ace of Clubs, button will end up folding by an extra 0.63%, which makes a lot of sense because the bulk of button's calling range actually contains an ace. So naturally, if the big blind holds an ace, he's going to make the button fold a little bit more. And we can also sort by folding frequency, and you'll see that all of the cards that have the best removal effect, or rather the cards that make the button fold more often, they're basically all pairs to the board. So Ace-X, 10-X, 7-X, 6-X, you can see they have a positive removal effect, where if you have one of these pairs, you're going to get a little bit more folds than if you don't. So this also explains why the big blind is so interested in turning lots of these one pair hands into a bluff, such as 10-9 and 10-8. Of course, we would, ideally we want to have like two pairs in our hand, but in that case, our hand would just be a value check raise instead of a bluff. So the best we can do is to use some kind of one pair hand without that much showdown value. Basically anything 10x and below is not going to have that much showdown value in the sense that it's really just a pure bluff catcher. We've already seen how Button's batting range is polarized between Ace-X and bluffs. So it doesn't really matter that much whether we have a 10 or a 6 or a 7 or even some kind of king high for that matter. These hands are really all just pure bluff catchers. So once again, the best that we can do is to choose some kind of one pair hand with a kicker that doesn't remove too much of our opponent's folding range. And if we scroll down the order, what we see is that the best unpaired cards to check raise with are more or less the 8s and the 9s. So for example, when we hold the 9 of spades, our opponent's folding frequency will increase by 0.04%, which is pretty much nothing at all. So 8x and 9x, they're more or less neutral cards. And that's really the best that we can hope for. So with 10-9, for example, the 10 in our hand would have a pretty good removal effect in terms of getting more folds. The 9 would be somewhat neutral, but that's way better than choosing something like King 10 or Queen 10, for example, because you can see as we scroll further down, some of these higher card hands that don't share cards with our value range, they actually have pretty poor removal. And you can kind of tell from the hand grid as well. Button is folding like Ace King, Ace Queen, Ace Jack almost all the time. So naturally it's going to make these cards much worse to bluff with. Let's do a quick recap. So far what we've seen is that in order for a hand to qualify as a good bluff, it needs to have this fundamental property whereby we can bluff it all the time and it doesn't make villain adjust in a way that makes our blockers bad. And we've seen that one of the ways that this is possible is when our bluffs share cards with our value range. But a second way that we can satisfy this criterion is when our bluffs are scarce. Here we have a second toy game, and once again I've just made one very small change to the aggressor's range. Instead of having Jack 10 suited and 9-8 suited as bluffs, I've given him Jack 10 suited and I've replaced 9-8 suited with 9-8 offsuit. So everything else remains the same. Our value range is still Ace King and our opponent still has a bunch of Ace-X bluff catchers. Only difference lies in the relative weights of Jack 10 and 9-8. 9-8 being an offsuit combo, we're definitely going to have much more of that. And just to make the effect a little bit more pronounced, I've actually further decreased the weight of Jack 10 suited. So we end up with a range that has a huge amount of 9-8 and very little Jack 10. And you can see that the solver just wants to bluff with Jack 10 all the time. And the reason why our opponent doesn't get to adjust in a way that makes our blockers bad is because even though we're bluffing with Jack 10 at 100% frequency, it doesn't necessarily mean that Jack 10 will be a big part of our bluffing range. Because the fact is, we just have so many more combos of 9-8 that even if we're bluffing it relatively infrequently, when you look at the composition of our bluffing range, it's still going to have way more 9-8 than Jack 10. And this actually allows for a situation where we're bluffing with Jack 10 all the time, but our opponent still prefers to call with Ace Jack and Ace 10. And this is why there are lots of situations where the solver will prefer bluffing combos that are more scarce. It's kind of like in real life where if you have a scarce item, it's naturally going to be worth more. And our opponent isn't really going to adjust in a way that makes our blockers bad, because he would actually have to call Ace 9 and Ace 8 in order to fold more Ace Jack and Ace 10. And it just doesn't make sense at all for him to do that when we have more 9-8 in our range compared to Jack 10. So, in lines where it gets checked to the river, emphasis on check to the river, how should we choose our bluffs? A, we want to bluff with hands that block the misflush draw. B, we want to bluff with hands that unblock the misflush draw. Or C, it doesn't matter. The correct answer is A. We want to bluff with hands that block the misflush draw. And at first this sounds a little strange because we're also used to hearing that we don't want to bluff with the misflush draw since we block our opponent's misflush draws that are folding. But that's usually true in lines where we are barreling down and our opponent is calling twice with his flush draws and folding all of them on the river. So in that case, yes, we wouldn't really want to interfere with his folding range. But in this example, we actually have a check down line. So this is the complete opposite of a triple barrel line. Our flush draws having a lot of equity and a lot of potential to improve. They usually want to bet the flop and the turn. So for every additional street that we check, we remove more and more flush draws from both players' ranges. So by the time we get to the river, you can see that the big blind, for example, really does not have very many two spade hands in his range. Whereas if I exclude hands that have a spade, you can see there's just a ton of these hands. Stuff like Jack 8 of hearts, 9-6 of clubs. And if you hover over any one of these boxes, you'll see that there's way more combos of hearts and clubs and diamonds relative to spades. And as a result, we once again have this situation where we prefer bluffing with spades all the time because spades are much more scarce and we can actually bet them at full frequency without making our opponent adjust in a way that's bad for us. So when we bluff with Jack X of spades, for example, it doesn't make our opponent react by folding more often with his bluff catchers that contain the Jack of spades. In fact, when you look at Jack 10, you can see that he actually calls Jack 10 with the Jack of spades more often than Jack 10 without the Jack of spades. If we look at the blocker scores of these hands, what we should see is that if we have the spade, we actually have slightly better trash removal. So remember that a low trash removal score means that you do not block as many trash hands and as many bluffs in your opponent's range, whereas a higher trash removal score means that you block more trash in your opponent's range. So even though the big blind is bluffing more often with the Jack of spades, it doesn't mean that Jack X of spades is a big part of his bluffing range, and this is very clearly reflected in the trash removal scores. So there was a question earlier on in the chat where someone asked why Ace-5 is checking so much more often compared to the rest of our trips. And this is where the blocker step can really come in handy. So let's say if you're looking at a sim and you're trying to figure out why Ace-5 specifically is checking so often, what you can do is go to the line where big blind checks to the button and click on this blockers tab. And when we sort by checking frequency, what we see is that the cards that make our opponent check back the most are actually mostly ace-x hands. When we have the ace of diamonds, for example, we end up making button check behind an extra 1.7%, which is quite significant. And that's also a great thing when we are trapping with a very strong hand, because the last thing we want to see is for our opponent to check back a ton. Whereas if we have a kicker that reduces his check back frequency, then he actually ends up betting more often, and that in turn allows us to put in a check raise that much more often. So that's the reason why ace-5 specifically is very interested in checking. Whereas if you compare it to something like 10-5 on the other hand, you can see that when we hold a 10 in our hand, we actually increase our opponent's checking frequency. And this is presumably because a big chunk of his value betting range in this line is 10x. So you don't really want to remove a 10 because that's going to make him check back much more often. And again, that's not a great thing when you are looking to trap with some kind of strong hand. So we can make a prediction here, which is that if we have a hand like 10-5, we should be much more inclined to just go ahead and bet for value. Checking wouldn't make quite as much sense knowing that our opponent is going to check back an extra 1.5 or 1.6% more. And that is in fact what we do see. 10-5 is betting pretty much all the time because it doesn't have quite as good properties for slow playing compared to ace-5. We can also use the blockers tab to visualize the best bluffs in the big blinds range. So in this case, we would have to go to the betting line. And when we look at the various cards in the big blinds range and how they affect the button's folding frequencies, you can actually see that there is quite a big difference between spade bluffs compared to other suits. For example, when we hold the ace of spades, we actually make the button fold an extra 0.39%. Compared to ace of hearts or diamonds or clubs, where these cards are more or less neutral, and in fact they even have like a slight negative effect because we make our opponent fold a little bit less. His folding frequency decreases by 0.18%, which is not a great thing when we are bluffing. So same goes with the jack of spades as well, very noticeably a good blocker. We make our opponent fold an extra 0.6% more, whereas the other suits have a pretty bad impact in the sense that they make the button call a little bit more often. And so far we've seen that one of the reasons why this is happening is because spades are scarce hands with respect to our own range, so we can bluff them all the time, and our opponent will still be quite inclined to call with bluff catchers that contain a spade. But I can already see some questions in the chat asking whether this also has something to do with the fact that our opponent has less spades. Because just like how we are betting most of our flush draws on the flop and the turn, the same thing applies to the button as well. You know, it's going to be betting most of his high equity draws on the earlier streets. So when it gets checked to the river, button also naturally has less spades in his range. And it would seem like this makes the big blind spades much better to bluff with. Maybe it even seems like a more important factor than scarcity. And certainly, you know, unblocking your opponent's misdraws, that's the sort of thing that people typically put a lot of weight to. But there's a reason why I personally don't think that unblocking misdraws is as important as bluffing hands that are scarce. And this reason is probably best explained using a toy game. So let's make a few changes to our baseline toy game. I'm going to keep the aggressor's range the same and just make a few changes to the defender's range. I'm going to add in a bunch of 9-4 and 8-4. So these hands represent misdraws that are always folding because they don't have any showdown value. They're losing to all of the aggressor's bluffs. And so let's run this new toy game and see what we get. Before we take a look at the solution, I encourage you guys to make a guess in terms of what we expect to see. You know, probably most people would imagine that we would just stop bluffing with 9-8 now, since we block a bunch of hands that are always folding. But take a minute to think about it, because the solution is really not what you would probably expect. So it turns out that even after we include all of these misdraws in our opponent's range, 9-8 is still bluffing at the exact same frequency as Jack 10. and it's doing this in spite of the fact that it's blocking a whole bunch of folds. And the reason why the solver doesn't mind bluffing with 9-8 is because the defender is actually compensating for all of these misdraws that is folding by calling ace-9 and ace-8 a little bit more often. Because once he fails to do this, and let's say he calls every single ace-x at the same frequency, now when you look at it from the aggressor's perspective, it's going to be much better for us to bluff with a hand like Jack-10. So we would basically adjust by bluffing Jack-10 all the time and giving up with 9-8 all the time. And in that case, there would be no longer any reason for our opponent to continue calling with ace-jack and ace-10. So what he needs to do is call with ace-9 and ace-8 a little bit more often, such that we are indifferent to bluffing with both Jack-10 and 9-8. Basically, he's just playing a strategy that makes our blockers a little bit less powerful, so that we cannot increase our EV by choosing certain specific bluffs that have very good removal and then just giving up the ones with bad removal. Of course, all of this is only possible if our opponent is able to compensate for the fact that he's folding all of these misdraws. So, for example, if we take away all these combos of ace-jack through ace-8 that interact with the misdraws in some way, and we replace them with bluff catchers that don't share cards with his misdraws, then of course from the aggressor's perspective, Jack-10 is just going to make a much better bluff. In this case, we can see Jack-10 is bluffing almost all the time and 9-8 is giving up all the time because 9-8 blocks a bunch of folds and our opponent isn't able to compensate for that by calling ace-9 and ace-8 more often, for example. And so the takeaway here is that whether or not you block folds in your opponent's range, that's something that is it's definitely going to be important in certain situations such as this one. But at the same time, there's also going to be a lot of other situations where your opponent is actually able to compensate for the fact that he's folding these misdraws. And let's say if you're playing online and you're playing 4 or 5 tables, you really have a very limited amount of time for every decision that you make. So in my opinion, it's not very practical to be trying to figure out stuff like, when is my opponent able to compensate for the fact that he has misdraws. And same thing for blocking nut hands as well. We can run a very similar toy game. So let's go back to our baseline toy game where the defender has ace-jack to ace-8. And I'm also going to add in a bunch of jack-3 and 10-3, this time to our opponent's range. And again, most players are going to think that this would make us more inclined to bluff with Jack-10 since we now block the nuts. But once again, this is something that our opponent can compensate for. You can see out of position is bluffing Jack-10 at exactly the same frequency as 9-8, because even though Jack-10 blocks some portion of nut hands in our opponent's range, but ultimately he's able to compensate for that by folding ace-jack and ace-10 a little bit more often. So when it comes to unblocking misdraws, blocking nut hands, these are things that only apply in certain specific situations, and it's actually pretty difficult to figure out when it applies and when it doesn't. So I think a much more practical approach is just to focus on the first 2 concepts that we've covered so far, which are choosing bluffs that share cards with your value range, as well as choosing bluffs that are scarce, because these 2 things will always apply in any situation. Here's an actual example of a situation where it's not that important whether or not we block the missed flush draw. So this is button versus big blind. Button is barreling down on a 2-tone board and the flush doesn't get there on the river. So if we filter for all of button's unpaired hands, we do see a little bit of a preference for bluffing with hands that unblock the missed flush draw. But then again, there's also plenty of combos such as Jack-10 and Queen-Jack suited, whereby we don't really see any kind of preference for not having spades. Jack-10 of spades is still bluffing at a very healthy frequency, and this is in spite of the fact that we do block quite a few missed flush draws. You can tell from the blocker score of your hand that when we have specifically Jack-10 of spades, we have a trash removal score of 6, which means that we block a whole lot of junk in our opponent's range that will fold all of the time. versus our bet, whereas if we have Jack 10 of hearts or diamonds or clubs, we have a really good trash removal score because we don't interfere with as much of our opponent's folding range. But despite this, you can see that all of these hands have identical EV. Regardless of our suits, all of these hands are indifferent between betting and checking. And the reason for this is that if you look at the big blind's response versus our bet, he's actually able to compensate for the fact that he's folding a bunch of extra missed flush draws by calling with hands such as King Jack with the Jack of Spades more often. And once again, he's designing his strategy in a way that makes our blockers less powerful, because if he didn't do this, and let's say if he called all of his King Jack at the same frequency, then of course we would just always give up with Jack 10 of Spades and bluff with hearts and diamonds and clubs. And we would actually be able to gain a little bit of EV that way. But by making sure that he's calling King Jack with the Jack of Spades at a slightly higher frequency, he puts us in a much tougher spot. And this is the reason why the solver really doesn't mind bluffing with hands like Jack 10 of Spades or Queen Jack of Spades. So if we look at how the various cards in Button's range affect big blind's frequencies, you actually see that, let's say when we look at the Jack or the 10, it really doesn't matter that much whether we have the Jack of Spades or the Jack of Hearts. All of these cards have a slightly negative removal effect. Same goes with the 10 of Spades, really not that different from 10 of Hearts or 10 of Diamonds. Because even though the 10 of Spades is blocking some extra missed flush draws, our opponent is also more inclined to call with King 10 with the 10 of Spades. So these two factors tend to cancel each other out. So let's take a look at one more example, this time where it actually does make a difference whether or not we block the missed flush draw. So here we have a slightly different situation where the ranges are much tighter. So small blind is 3-betting against early position, but the board is exactly the same. We're barreling down on the two-tone board and the flush draw also breaks out. So let's take a look at some of the small blind's potential bluffs. If we filter for ace high or worse, now we actually see quite a big difference in terms of whether or not we prefer to bluff with spades. Here you can see that spades are almost pure checking with the exception of some lower combos that don't block as much of our opponent's range. And if we exclude spades, these hands are betting at a much higher frequency, or almost slightly more than 3/4 of the time. And this is because compared to the previous example, you can see that having a spade in our hand actually reduces our opponent's folding frequency by quite a bit more. So the Jack of Spades in this case actually causes us to get almost 2% less folds compared to hearts and diamonds and clubs that still have a slight negative effect, but not quite as pronounced as the Jack of Spades or the 10 of Spades as well. And just like in the previous card game that we looked at, this is happening because the defender is unable to compensate for the fact that he's folding all of these extra missed flush draws. In the previous sim, where ranges were slightly wider, he had a bunch of King Jack and King 10 with a spade that he could call a little bit more often. But because this is small blind versus UTG doesn't have any King X offsuit at all, so this straight up makes it pretty bad for the small blind to be bluffing with spades. In conclusion, when we're choosing bluffs, we want to be looking out for two main things. We want to choose bluffs that are scarce, and we want to choose bluffs that share cards with our value range. And what we've seen is that these are the two main ways that we can continue bluffing our hand and not have our opponent adjust in a way that makes our blockers bad. When it comes to blocking the nuts or unblocking misdraws, these are things that are sometimes important but not always. So it makes a little bit more sense to focus on scarcity as well as card sharing, since we're going to have limited time for every decision that we're making. So it's just a little bit more practical to focus on the things that are always true. If you can achieve 80% of the accuracy with 20% of the effort, then that's definitely a good result in my book. But if you want to be a little bit more precise, then when you're thinking about blocking the nuts or unblocking misdraws, just make sure that it's not a situation where your opponent can compensate for these things by calling or folding some of his bluff catchers a little bit more often. So that's all I have for you guys. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content. And you can also check out my own channel at Poker Giraffe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.